Many alien girl feared the human would devour her until his kindness took an unexpected turn. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main characters. The wind howled across the desolate planet, a place so cold that even the stars seemed to shiver. The icy landscape stretched endlessly, with jagged cliffs and frozen plains reflecting a pale, distant sun. Amidst the bleakness, a figure struggled through the snow, her small form barely visible against the white void. Aurelia, the alien girl, was terrified. Her violet eyes darted nervously as her tiny footsteps left no trace in the thick snow. Her skin, a deep shade of blue, shimmered under the cold sun, but it offered little protection against the frigid air. She had never encountered a human before, and the stories of their aggression filled her mind with fear. According to the elders, humans were ruthless predators, capable of devouring anything that crossed their path. But today, her desperation left her with no choice but to trust whatever she could find in this alien world. As she stumbled forward, the sharp crack of a twig underfoot made her freeze. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was it him? The human? Her breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively crouched low, her small form trembling in fear. Suddenly, the wind shifted, and she caught a glimpse of him, tall, broad-shouldered, with skin as pale as the snow beneath her feet. The human. He stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his eyes fixed on her. His expression was unreadable, yet there was something different about him. He wasn't looking at her with the hunger she had expected. In fact, his eyes seemed curious. "Are you lost, little one?" His voice was surprisingly gentle, not at all like the harsh tone she had imagined. Aurelia's heart raced even faster, the fear mixing with confusion. Why was he speaking to her so kindly? Humans were not supposed to show kindness. They were predators, killers. But there he was, standing in front of her, his hand outstretched in a gesture of peace. She wanted to run, to flee from this strange creature, but something in his eyes made her hesitate. There was no malice in his gaze, only concern. For a moment, Aurelia struggled with herself. She had been taught to fear humans, to avoid them at all costs. But this was something different. She could feel a warmth radiating from him, an unexpected kindness that made her lower her guard, just for a moment. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of reassurance. "You don't have to be afraid." Aurelia stood there, staring at him, torn between fear and the strange, almost magnetic pull of his words. It was true, he had not shown any signs of aggression. In fact, he seemed more concerned for her than she had ever expected. Slowly, she took a cautious step toward him, her small hands trembling at her sides. She didn't know what to do, what to say. Her instincts told her to run, to get away from him as fast as possible. But there was something about his presence, something that made her feel safe. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not like them?" The human raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the question. "Like them? Who do you mean?" Aurelia's heart skipped a beat. She had almost forgotten the stories, the warnings of her people. She had been taught that humans were monsters, that they would devour anything they could catch. But this man, this human, was different. She felt it deep inside her, even though she couldn't explain why. I was told humans would devour me," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "That's what they do, isn't it?" The human's expression softened, and he shook his head. "That's not who we are. We are many things, but I promise you, I am not going to hurt you." His words felt genuine, and the tension in her chest began to loosen, just a little. Slowly, she let her guard down, taking another step closer. She couldn't help it. There was something about him, something that made her trust him against all logic. He wasn't like the others. Perhaps, just maybe, she could believe him. And as Aurelia stepped forward, the fear that had gripped her heart began to fade, replaced by a strange, unexpected warmth. Something in the air shifted. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a bond that would change everything. And maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something neither of them had expected. James watched as Aurelia took a few cautious steps towards him, her violet eyes never leaving his face. The tension that had gripped her earlier had slowly started to fade, replaced by a reluctant curiosity. Her small frame trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cold and the unfamiliarity of the situation. The wind howled around them, but it seemed less menacing now, as if the storm had softened in response to their growing bond. James took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had faced countless dangerous situations before, but this was different. The little alien girl standing before him, so fragile and wary, was more than just a creature from another world. She was someone who, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, had come to trust him, even if just a little. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice low and gentle, breaking the silence between them. Aurelia nodded slowly, her gaze flicking briefly to the hand he had offered her earlier, still hanging in the air between them. I think so," she replied, her voice barely audible over the wind. "But I'm not used to this." Her words were soft, tinged with both wonder and a hint of fear, but there was something more there too, something new. James stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, making sure not to startle her. He could see that her small body was shaking, whether from the cold or from something else, he couldn't tell. He wished he could do more, but for now, he could only offer her his warmth and the shelter of his presence. "Come on," he said, extending his arm to her once more. "Let's find somewhere safe. We can get you out of this storm." Aurelia hesitated, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. When she found none, she took a small step forward, reaching out for his arm. The touch was tentative, as if she was still unsure whether she should trust him, but it was a step in the right direction. Together they made their way through the storm, the snow biting at their skin, but the warmth of each other's presence making it easier to endure. They walked in silence, the only sound being the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the howling wind that seemed to follow them wherever they went. As they reached a small rock formation, James led Aurelia to a narrow opening in the stone, a natural shelter from the storm. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them some respite. James set down his pack and pulled out a thermal blanket, offering it to her with a smile. "This should help keep you warm," he said, his voice soft. Aurelia took the blanket with a hesitant nod, wrapping it around her shoulders. She sat down on the cold ground, her eyes still focused on him. James sat beside her, keeping a careful distance but still within reach, just in case she needed him. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I didn't mean to think you would hurt me." James looked at her, surprised by her apology. "You don't have to apologize," he replied, his voice warm. "I understand why you were scared. I can't imagine what it must have been like for you, not knowing who I was or what I wanted." Aurelia's eyes softened at his words, and for the first time since they had met, she seemed to relax. The tension that had once clouded her face lifted, replaced by a fragile but genuine smile. "You're different," she said quietly. "I thought humans were all the same, but you're not like the others." James felt a lump form in his throat at her words. He had always known that people, humans, could be more than just warriors or fighters. They could be compassionate, kind, and brave. And here, in this moment, with this alien girl, he was reminded of that truth. He wasn't just a soldier or a survivor. He was a human, capable of kindness, capable of offering help to those who needed it. "I'm glad you think so," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They sat in silence for a while, the storm outside howling as the warmth from the blanket slowly seeped into Aurelia's chilled bones. She closed her eyes, her body finally starting to relax. James kept his gaze fixed on her, watching the way she breathed, the way her chest rose and fell with each deep inhale. He couldn't help but admire her. She was so small, so fragile, but there was a strength in her that he could see, a resilience that made him want to protect her, to make sure she was safe. And for the first time in a long while, he realized that maybe he wasn't just here to survive. Maybe he was here to help someone else survive too. As the storm raged outside, James and Aurelia found comfort in each other's company. In that cold, unforgiving place, they had found something unexpected: trust. The hours passed in the small shelter, the wind outside still howling with relentless force. Inside, the warmth from the thermal blanket had begun to sink into Aurelia's chilled bones, But the silence between her and James remained heavy. She sat cross-legged, her violet eyes occasionally flicking to him, unsure of what to say next. James, too, felt the weight of the quiet, but he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between them. His mind raced, wondering what he could do to help her. The alien girl had seen so much fear in her short life, and here he was, a human, an unknown in a world she had been taught to fear. Finally, he broke the silence. "You're doing okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low and soft, careful not to startle her. Aurelia nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a sadness, perhaps, or an unspoken question. "I've never met a human before," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I've only heard the stories, the ones about how you hunt, how you fight, how you devour others to survive." James stiffened at her words, a wave of guilt washing over him. He had heard those stories too, about humans being predators, feared by many across the galaxy. He wasn't proud of the reputation that his species had earned, but there was nothing he could do to change it. Or was there? "I'm not like that," he said, his voice firm. "I don't fight for the sake of fighting, and I don't harm others unless I have to. That's not who I am." Aurelia's eyes met his, searching his face for any sign of deceit. She didn't speak for a long moment, but when she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "But you're different, right? You're not like the others I've heard about." James looked at her, his heart tightening at the vulnerability in her words. He wanted to reach out, to tell her that she didn't need to be afraid, that she was safe with him. But something told him that words wouldn't be enough. He needed to show her. "Yeah," he said softly, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm different, and I'm not going to hurt you." Aurelia nodded slowly, as if considering his words. Her gaze softened slightly, but there was still hesitation in her expression. "Then why help me?" she asked, her voice small, almost as if she was afraid of the answer. James thought for a moment before replying, his tone steady. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "I don't need a reason to help someone in need. No one deserves to be out here alone in the cold." Aurelia was silent again, her mind clearly processing his words. For the first time, she let her guard down a little more, her shoulders relaxing as she took in the warmth he offered. James could feel the shift in the air between them, a fragile trust starting to form, one step at a time. He didn't expect it to happen all at once. Trust was something earned, not given freely, especially not in a world full of fear and uncertainty. But he hoped that with time, she would come to see him for who he truly was, not a predator, but someone willing to risk everything to protect others. "I don't know what happens next," she said, her voice small but steady. "I've never trusted anyone like this before." James nodded, understanding her words more than she could know. He had lived a life where trust was hard to come by, where betrayal and disappointment had taught him to keep people at arm's length. But something about Aurelia was different. She wasn't just another mission, another enemy. She was someone in need, someone he could help. And maybe, just maybe, she could help him in ways he never expected. "I don't know what happens next either," he replied. "But for now, we've got shelter. And we've got each other." Aurelia gave him a tentative smile, her eyes meeting his with something new in them. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the beginnings of it. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. The morning after the storm, the world outside was still blanketed in snow, the harsh winds subsiding into an eerie calm. James and Aurelia had remained in the small shelter throughout the night, the fire they had started burning low, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Aurelia had slept fitfully, curled up in the thermal blanket, her mind still wrestling with the events of the day before. But as the first light of dawn filtered through the narrow opening in the rock, a sense of peace had settled between them. James sat near the fire, his arms crossed, staring into the dim flames. He had been up for hours, not wanting to disturb Aurelia, but also knowing that the time had come to make a decision. He could not stay here forever, and neither could she. Eventually, they would need to move, to find a way off this planet, or at least find shelter where they could begin to figure out what came next. He shifted his gaze to the alien girl, still sleeping, her delicate blue skin glowing softly in the firelight. There was something so fragile about her, yet he could sense a strength in her, a resilience that he admired. But he also saw the weight of the world in her eyes. She had been alone for so long, hunted and feared by those who didn't understand her. And now, here she was, with him, the human who, for reasons unknown, had chosen to help her. The thought brought a strange sense of comfort. Aurelia stirred, her eyelids fluttering as she slowly woke. She glanced around, disoriented for a moment, before her eyes locked with his. For a brief second, the tension from the previous days returned, but it quickly faded as she realized she was safe. With him. "Morning," James said quietly, offering a small smile. Aurelia nodded, sitting up and wrapping the blanket tightly around herself. "Morning," she replied, her voice still soft, but there was a slight change in her tone. A trace of warmth. The unease between them seemed to be melting away, bit by bit. James studied her for a moment, unsure how to proceed. He knew the next step would be crucial. They couldn't stay here forever. He had to figure out a plan, and soon. "We need to get moving," he said finally, breaking the silence. "The storm's passed, but we can't stay here too long. There's a settlement about a day's journey from here. We should head there, get you some help." Aurelia blinked, her expression unreadable for a moment. "Help?" she asked, a hint of skepticism in her voice. "Why would they help me?" James hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know this. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Not with me here. I'll protect you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Aurelia stared at him, her violet eyes searching his face. For the first time, she didn't seem to be looking for something to fear. She was just looking. And then, something shifted in her. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. "You're really not like the others," she said, her voice almost in awe. You mean it?" James nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him at her words. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "I mean it," he said firmly. He stood up, offering her a hand to help her to her feet. She hesitated for a moment, then took it. As she rose, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, it felt like the weight of the universe had lifted off her shoulders. They weren't just two strangers anymore. They were allies, perhaps even something more. Aurelia didn't speak as she adjusted her blanket, but there was a new light in her eyes. She wasn't as fearful now, and that meant more than words could express. Together, they packed their belongings, preparing for the journey ahead. James made sure to gather what little supplies they had left: water, food, and extra layers of clothing. He knew the journey would be difficult, but at least they wouldn't have to face it alone. They left the shelter behind and began their trek through the snow, stepping into the unknown with only the promise of each other's company to guide them. The cold was biting, but it didn't feel as harsh now. With each step they took, the bond between them grew stronger, the silence between them more comfortable. They were no longer just human and alien. They were two souls bound by circumstance, walking side by side into a future that neither could predict. As they moved forward, James glanced at Aurelia, who was walking beside him, her eyes focused ahead, but her presence undeniable. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She was strong, and he was going to make sure she never felt alone again. The journey to the settlement was long and grueling, but the silence between James and Aurelia was no longer uncomfortable. The cold winds continued to whip through the landscape, but they had found a rhythm, walking side by side, step by step. James kept a steady pace, ensuring that Aurelia was managing the harsh conditions as best as she could. He knew she was still recovering from the fear and exhaustion of the previous days, and he couldn't help but glance at her from time to time, making sure she was okay. Aurelia, despite her small frame and fragile appearance, was proving to be more resilient than he had first expected. She walked with a quiet determination, her violet eyes scanning the terrain ahead as if searching for something. James admired her strength, the way she had pushed aside her fear to follow him through the wilderness. He didn't know how much longer they could keep this up. The settlement wasn't that far now, but the constant snow and cold made the journey harder than it should have been. James had been in worse conditions before, but seeing Aurelia struggle in this unfamiliar world stirred something protective inside him. "How are you holding up?" he asked, breaking the silence. Aurelia didn't immediately respond, her gaze fixed on the snowy horizon. After a moment, she nodded. "I'm fine," she said quietly, her voice steady but soft. "Just not used to this." James nodded, understanding. "It's not easy, but we're getting there. We'll make it." The words felt almost as much for himself as for her. The thought of reaching the settlement gave him a small sense of relief, but he knew it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of whatever came next. After a few more hours of trudging through the snow, the settlement finally came into view, small buildings rising in the distance, nestled among the trees. James's heart lifted slightly at the sight. He had been hoping for this moment for a while, and now that it was here, it felt both like an answer and an uncertain new start. As they made their way toward the settlement, James could see a few figures moving in the distance, probably settlers going about their business, unaware of the strange visitors approaching. The closer they got, the more Aurelia seemed to tense, her steps slowing slightly. "Are you okay?" James asked, noticing her unease. Aurelia glanced up at him, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "I don't know if I belong there," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can," she trailed off, her words hanging in the cold air between them. James stopped walking and turned to face her, sensing her hesitation. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said gently. "But I promise you, they won't hurt you. I'll be right there with you. You're not alone anymore." Aurelia met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt. She must have found none, because after a moment, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's go." They continued toward the settlement, now with the unmistakable tension of what lay ahead. The people in the settlement were unlike anything Aurelia had encountered before. They were human, of course, but the way they lived, the way they carried themselves, it was all foreign to her. James had warned her that things might be difficult at first, but he assured her that they would find a way to make it work. They entered the settlement, and as they walked through the narrow streets, the few people who noticed them gave curious looks, but no one seemed hostile. It was a quiet place, peaceful, with no signs of the violence or fear Aurelia had grown accustomed to. As they made their way through the heart of the settlement, a man approached them, his weathered face breaking into a friendly smile as he took in James. "James Parker, is it?" he asked, extending his hand. James smiled and shook it. "That's me. How's everything been here?" The man nodded, looking over at Aurelia before returning his gaze to James. "It's been quiet, but we're happy to see you back. And, who's this?" He nodded toward Aurelia, who was standing slightly behind James, her eyes darting around nervously. "She's with me," James said, his voice firm, yet calm. She's in need of some help." The man's gaze softened when he saw the fear in Aurelia's eyes. He nodded slowly, stepping aside. "We don't turn away those in need here," he said gently. "Come on in. We'll figure things out." As James led Aurelia into the settlement, he could feel the weight of her uncertainty, but he also felt the warmth of the welcome they were receiving. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would be okay. The settlement was quieter than James had expected. The houses were modest, built from wood and stone, with smoke rising from chimneys as the inhabitants went about their daily tasks. It was a peaceful place, one that didn't seem like it belonged in the midst of a hostile world. But as James led Aurelia through the streets, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her past, the years of running, hiding, fearing for her life. She had never been in a place like this, surrounded by people who seemed so ordinary. They didn't seem to be afraid of her, or of the stories they had heard about her kind. The man who had greeted them, a burly figure with a thick beard and calloused hands, led them to a modest cabin near the center of the settlement. He motioned for them to enter, his expression warm but cautious. "Make yourselves comfortable," he said, stepping aside to let them in. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a large wooden table in the center of the room. There were 2 chairs near the fire, and James immediately pulled one out for Aurelia, helping her sit down. He could tell that she was still unsure, still hesitant about the strange surroundings, but he didn't blame her. This was a new world for her, one that didn't have the same dangers she was used to. He sat down beside her, close enough to offer a sense of security but not intruding on her space. The man, who had introduced himself as Samuel, sat across from them, eyeing Aurelia with a mix of curiosity and kindness. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Samuel said, his voice soft but direct. Aurelia nodded, her eyes downcast. She was still processing everything that had happened, the storm, the journey, the strange human who had taken her in. But the kindness in James's actions was starting to sink in. She hadn't known that humans could be like this. She had been taught to fear them, to avoid them at all costs. But here she was, sitting in a warm cabin, with a human who wasn't trying to harm her. "I've never been treated like this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do." Samuel smiled, his expression gentle. "You don't have to do anything right now," he said. "You're safe here. We'll take care of you, as best as we can. But you have to understand, not everyone is going to see you the way James does. Some people, they might still fear you." James nodded, understanding the weight of Samuel's words. He had known this was coming. It was one thing for him to stand by Aurelia, but the rest of the world wasn't so forgiving. "We'll figure it out," James said, his voice steady. "But for now, Aurelia, just take it one step at a time. You don't have to prove anything." Aurelia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She wanted to believe him, but after everything she had been through, it was hard to trust so easily. The world had never been kind to her. The idea of being accepted, of finding a place where she belonged, felt like a distant dream. But as she looked around the cabin, at the warmth and peace that surrounded them, she couldn't help but wonder if this could be real. "I've never had a place to call home," she whispered. "I don't know how to fit in here." Samuel leaned forward, his eyes kind. "You don't have to fit in, child," he said. "You just have to be yourself. That's all anyone can ask for." Aurelia didn't know what to say to that. She had spent so long trying to hide, trying to protect herself from the world. The idea of letting her guard down, of truly being herself in front of others, was terrifying. But there was something in Samuel's voice, something in James's unwavering support, that made her want to try. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a new path here. A path where she didn't have to run anymore. James could see the change in Aurelia's expression, the way her shoulders had relaxed a little, the way her eyes had softened. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "It'll take time," he said, breaking the silence. "But you're not alone. Not anymore." Aurelia nodded, a small, hesitant smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. And in that moment, as the fire crackled and the world outside seemed a little less cold, she realized that maybe she had found something more valuable than safety. Maybe she had found a place where she could truly belong. Days passed, and Aurelia slowly began to adapt to life in the settlement. It wasn't easy, but every moment seemed like a small victory. The fear that had once clouded her every thought began to fade, replaced by a tentative sense of peace. The people in the settlement, though wary at first, had started to accept her presence. They had seen how James stood by her, how he had protected her when she was vulnerable, and that was enough to earn them some trust. She spent her days helping around the cabin where she stayed with James, learning how to perform simple tasks like cooking, cleaning, and even helping with the occasional repair. There was a rhythm to the work that made the days feel less overwhelming, even though she was still adjusting to the fact that she was no longer on the run. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of belonging, a place where she wasn't feared or hunted. But there were still moments when her past would catch up with her, when the memories of the people who had mistreated her, of the things she had done to survive, would come rushing back. And in those moments, she would pull away, retreating into herself. She couldn't help it. It was a reflex, a way of protecting herself. James noticed these moments, but he never pushed her. He gave her the space she needed while still offering her his support, his quiet presence reminding her that she wasn't alone. One evening, as they sat together near the fire, James looked over at her, noticing the distant look in her eyes. She had been quiet for the last few hours, her mind seemingly lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" he asked softly, his voice low so as not to startle her. Aurelia blinked, as though pulled out of a deep reverie. She hesitated for a moment, then met his gaze. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've given me a chance at something I thought I could never have. A place where I'm safe. A place where I don't have to be afraid." James smiled, his eyes warm. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice steady. "You deserve this. You deserve peace, and you deserve a place to call home." Aurelia looked down at her hands, a small, faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I didn't think that was possible," she murmured. "Not for someone like me. I've spent so long running. Hiding." She trailed off, her words heavy with the weight of her past. James reached across the space between them, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to run anymore," he said softly. "You don't have to hide. You're not alone." The words seemed to settle in the air between them, filling the room with a warmth that went beyond the fire crackling in the hearth. Aurelia closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the peace of the moment to wash over her. She had never known what it felt like to truly be at ease, to be in a place where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder. But with James by her side, she was starting to feel it. She was starting to believe that she could be something more than the scared, hunted girl she had been for so long. When she opened her eyes again, she met James's gaze, and this time, the smile that appeared on her face was more genuine, more confident. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. "For everything." James nodded, his smile matching hers. "You don't have to thank me," he repeated, his voice soft. "You've got this. You're stronger than you know." Aurelia looked out the window, the dark night stretching out before them. But for the first time, the darkness didn't feel so overwhelming. There was light now, a small but steady light in the form of a human who had shown her kindness when she had expected none. And for the first time, Aurelia felt like she had a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to find the peace she had always longed for. As she sat there, her shoulders a little less tense, her heart a little less heavy, she realized that maybe, just maybe, her life was finally beginning again. And it was a life she could shape, a life where she didn't have to be afraid anymore. The road ahead wasn't clear, but with James by her side, Aurelia knew she could face whatever came next. The future, uncertain as it was, didn't seem so daunting now. She wasn't alone. And that, more than anything, was enough. The following days brought a new sense of normalcy to their lives in the settlement. Aurelia's nerves had started to settle, and while she still held on to her past fears, the kindness and acceptance from the people around her made each day a little easier. James had kept his word, and with every passing moment, his presence was more of a comfort than a reminder of the danger that had once surrounded them. She had spent her days helping with small tasks around the cabin, learning new skills, and slowly starting to open up to the people who lived in the settlement. It was a world she had never imagined, a world where she wasn't hunted, where she wasn't feared for being different. There were moments, though, when doubt crept in, and she would retreat into herself. But James never let her stay alone for long, always offering a quiet word of encouragement, a steady presence in the background. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together near the hearth. The fire flickered in the dim light, casting warm shadows across the walls of their cabin. Aurelia leaned back against the wall, her thoughts drifting. It was peaceful here, too peaceful, sometimes. She could hardly remember the last time she had felt so safe. The thought made her uneasy, like a part of her was waiting for the other shoe to drop. James, sensing her quiet contemplation, spoke first. "You're doing great," he said, his voice gentle as always. "I know it's hard, but you're adapting. You're stronger than you realize." Aurelia turned to him, meeting his steady gaze. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she was capable of letting go of the fear that had been with her for so long. But it was hard to ignore the weight of her past, the ghosts that still haunted her. "Sometimes, I don't know if I can really stay here," she admitted softly. "Everything is so different. I don't belong here." James studied her carefully, his face softening. "You belong here because you're you. You've already shown more strength than you realize by being here. You've survived a lot, Aurelia. You don't have to be anyone else. You just need to be yourself." Aurelia sighed, her eyes dropping to her hands in her lap. It wasn't that she didn't want to be part of this peaceful world, but part of her was still afraid. She didn't know how to let go of the fight that had been her life for so long. She didn't know how to trust that she could be accepted without fear. "What if they find out? What if they see me as I am?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "What if they don't accept me?" James shifted closer, his presence filling the space between them. "They already see you, Aurelia. They see the person you are now. Not the past, not the stories. Just you. And the people here, they're different. They understand that sometimes, people need time. It's not about fitting in perfectly. It's about finding a place where you can be at peace." Aurelia nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely convinced. There was still a part of her that felt like an outsider, like she was pretending to be something she wasn't. But as she looked at James, she realized that maybe she didn't have to be anything other than herself. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she didn't have to run from who she was. As the night wore on, the fire slowly began to die down, and the room grew quieter. James stood up to add another log to the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. Aurelia watched him for a moment, then stood up herself. She stepped over to the window, looking out at the dark, star-filled sky. It was beautiful here, peaceful in a way she had never known. For a long time, she had only known fear, only known how to survive. But now she was beginning to see that there might be more to life than just survival. Maybe there was room for something else, something she hadn't dared to hope for before. She glanced back at James, who was watching her quietly from across the room. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but full of sincerity. "For everything." James gave her a small smile, his eyes soft. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice warm. "You've got this. You just need to believe in yourself." And for the first time in a long time, Aurelia felt the weight of her past begin to lift. She wasn't sure where her path would take her next, but with James by her side, she felt like she could finally face whatever came. The fear that had once defined her was starting to fade, replaced by something new, something like hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there, and that was enough for now. The days in the settlement grew warmer, and with each passing morning, Aurelia's sense of peace deepened. It was still a strange world to her, but the fear that once gripped her heart had slowly loosened its hold. The people of the settlement had come to accept her, offering small acts of kindness that began to chip away at the walls she had built around herself. James was always there, a constant presence beside her, offering support when she needed it and giving her the space to grow when she didn't. He had kept his word. She wasn't alone anymore. One afternoon, as they worked together outside, stacking firewood for the winter, Aurelia paused and glanced at James. "James," she said softly, her voice a little unsure, I think I'm starting to believe it. That I belong here." James looked over at her, the warmth of the sun reflecting in his eyes. "I knew you would," he said with a smile. "You've got a lot to offer, Aurelia. More than you think." She nodded slowly, the words sinking in deeper than she had expected. For so long, she had believed that she would never find a place where she could truly belong. The thought of being accepted, of being seen for who she really was, had seemed impossible. But here, in this small settlement, with these people who treated her like she was more than just a stranger, she could finally see a glimpse of that reality. The people she had met, though cautious at first, had come to trust her, to see her as someone more than the rumors and fear that had followed her all her life. Samuel, the man who had first greeted them when they arrived, had even offered her a place in the community, suggesting that she help with some of the more hands-on tasks that were needed. Aurelia had hesitated at first, unsure of how much she could contribute, but the offer had felt genuine. And with James by her side, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could make this work. That evening, after a long day of work, James and Aurelia sat together by the fire, the flickering light casting shadows on the walls of their cabin. The stars outside were brighter than Aurelia had ever seen them, their light shining through the clear, cold night. It was a beautiful sight, one that reminded her of the vastness of the world she now found herself in. But for the first time, she didn't feel small in it. She felt like she could finally breathe, like she was part of something bigger. "Do you ever wonder what comes next?" Aurelia asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. James looked at her thoughtfully, his gaze soft. "Sometimes," he said slowly. "But for now we have this. And that's enough." Aurelia nodded, her heart settling into a sense of peace she hadn't known she could feel. She didn't need to have everything figured out. She didn't need to have all the answers. What mattered was that, for the first time, she felt like she was where she was meant to be. "Yeah," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is enough." The wind outside howled softly, but inside the cabin, there was only warmth. James and Aurelia sat together, side by side, watching the fire crackle in front of them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't feel so frightening. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, she could finally build the life she had always wanted. A life that was hers to shape, without fear, without running. A life where she could finally be herself. The road ahead was still long, but Aurelia knew that, With James by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next.